Welcome to EDI on BIV. I'm Hayley Woodin, Executive Editor at Business in Vancouver. And I'm joined today by my guest co-host, Vivian Chan, a champion and supporter of Canadian startups and Vancouver startup community. She is the Director of National Operations at Yale Canada and co-chair of Vancouver Startup Week. Vivian, great to have you on our show as a host today.
Thanks for having me.
And at the upcoming Vancouver Startup Week, we'll be discussing a very important conversation with a guest who will be presenting during that week on the topic of why hiring people with disabilities is good for business. Jamie Millar-Dixon joins us today. She is a principal consultant with McLeod Silver HR Business Partners and an inclusive workforce consultant with BC Partners in Workforce Innovation, or BC WIN. Jamie, great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Haley. Great to be here. Thank you.
I want to start off with a question about how we define EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and whether you feel that people who are differently abled, people with disabilities, are often considered when we talk about corporate strategies around EDI.
You know, that's a really great question. I think we're very fortunate here in the Lower Mainland to have the President's Group organization. So this is a group of CEOs of fairly large organizations, but also some small businesses that have committed their organizations to be inclusive of people with disabilities or those with diverse abilities. Companies like Van City, ICBC, YVR. So we're really fortunate to have that leadership in our own communities. But I do think that people are often overlooked. People with diverse abilities are often overlooked, and those themes for DEI can change almost on an annual basis. You know, sometimes the focus is on having more women in certain levels of positions, having more Indigenous people working in organizations, but people with disabilities are often left behind.
Mm. Yeah, it's on our first episode in this show, we spoke a little bit about how the term BIPOC or even EDI can perhaps be overly broad. And as you mentioned, sometimes there's a specific theme around supporting women in business or whatever it may be. And I'm curious if maybe there's something that can be done, or maybe it's being done with BC WIN to raise more awareness around how having diverse abilities, whatever that may look like, might really benefit a workplace.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really great work, again, coming out of the Lower Mainland around that, because I think there's been a lot of success in hiring and retaining people with disabilities here. I think we've got a lot of great work that's being done by a community of either business leaders or organizations like the Accessible Workforce Consultants through President's Group. People are talking about it and sharing those experiences and opportunities. So there is a lens that is focused on this for us, which is, very fortunate, because we've got there's a lot going on in BC, and we have a lot to share with other provinces across the country as well.
Mm-hmm. And Vivian, feel free to jump in here, but I'd be curious too for your thoughts on what's happening in tech as well, because that's such an interesting industry to look at in terms of increasing diversity.
Yeah, especially with, I think, a lot of the small businesses in the city, when we're thinking about diversity, it's often gender or even race. And I think, disability seems to be left out of that conversation. And I don't know if sometimes it's just because they are a small business, it's not something that's always in their face. So I guess curious on just what some of those common misconceptions might be, for someone who's in a small business and wants to do something about it, but are kind of scared to take that first step. What are those misconceptions that often pop up?
Yeah, I think that is kind of what really gets in the way, right? And it kind of, I think the biggest misconception is that people would perform less than other coworkers. Mm-hmm. Which is really not the case. And that, combined with the perception that it costs a lot to hire someone with a disability, but that's, that gets in the way of inclusive hiring, where research shows us that, most people hired with diverse abilities, it costs nothing at all. And on average, if, most require less than $500 of adjustments in the workplace to make that happy and to make that possible. But yet, we have really good data out of Deloitte, and that gets updated every couple of years, that organizations that are inclusive of people with disabilities are twice as likely to meet their financial targets. They're 6 times more likely to be innovative, because there is that diversity of thought and abilities. Also 6 times more likely to be able to anticipate change. And the staff retention rates in organizations that are inclusive of people with disabilities is really high. And so having an impact on those constant turnover rates, especially in, look at positions like in retail, food and hospitality sectors, that really adds up if you're saving due to lower turnover. So I always say, and I say this all the time, is really the question is, can your business afford not to be inclusive?
That's a really important question. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious. So Vivian brought up a good point about the misconceptions. One other thing that's on my mind is whether it is easy for companies to hire these individuals, especially if they have a process where it's generally applicants coming to them, and whether the pool of potential applicants or hirees is diverse to begin with.
Mm-hmm. I think there are a lot of great resources in the communities that can support businesses right across the province, but we're especially fortunate here in the Lower Mainland. We have a lot of great organizations that support people who are focused on employment to gain access to employment. So, you know, the Work BC centers, Community Living BC organizations, Canadian Mental Health Association, Vancouver Coastal Health, they all have employment specialists that work with different people to help them gain access to employment. So for employers, it's sometimes they don't really know where to go. That becomes the biggest challenge. It's like, where do I go to if I want to be inclusive, if I want my workforce to reflect our communities and our customer base? Where do I find people?
Do you think that there's a bit of that concern for an employer to, explicitly state that they want to hire people with disabilities? Do you think that they're a little concerned about asking that question?
I think some might be concerned about that, but they don't need to be. Like there's if we recognize that people with disabilities are, really underrepresented in the workplace, and as an employer, I want to make sure my workplace reflects communities, then it's okay to start that conversation with a trusted community partner. Reach out to your local Work BC center or contact us. We'll help with that. I mean, to us, there's no such thing as a silly question. It's a safe environment for employers to ask the questions that they need answers to, and unconscious bias plays into some of those decisions as well, whether we realize it. It's unconscious, whether we realize it or not. And sometimes there's actual real bias that plays into those conversations. Do I want to hire someone with a mental health condition? Right?
That's a good point. Yeah, I'm a bit curious because I think about everything that workplaces have gone through over the past year, and how people who may not think that they have a disability still need certain accommodations, still need certain kinds of support. Mental health, I think, there's a lot of awareness raised around that piece and a lot of work to be done. But is it a positive thing to maybe try and think that, we're all part of this conversation about diverse abilities, as opposed to sort of reserving that for people who maybe by some kind of definition have a disability, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does. And it's funny. It's funny you should say that, because we were doing something with the post-secondary organizations, institutions, so SFU and UBC in particular. And there was a young man there who I had interviewed following some career discussions we were having with students with disabilities, grads and alumni. And he clearly had a vision impairment, right? We were on Zoom, we could see that. And he said to me, I don't associate with having a disability. So there's a whole generation of people coming up who have been, and who are in the workforce now, who have been raised with inclusion. Inclusion is an expectation. It's a norm. People weren't segregated, right, into different schools or systems. So, childhood friends had a disability. So, those sorts of norms are going to really affect what we want from our employers in the future. They're impacting that now for an entire generation of people. But I also think that COVID has really exposed some real gaps in employment. There's probably people with disabilities were the most impacted in terms of job loss. And so we've got a little bit of work to do following COVID. But one of the really interesting things that we've seen through BC Win is organizations actually in the last couple of months opening up, coming to us and saying, listen, we really want to be focused more in this area. Ledcor is a perfect example, right? Fairly large organization. They want to be more inclusive of people with disabilities. And now they're going to focus on putting the measures in place to do that.
Do you think it might actually be easier going forward? Because I think with COVID and everyone being at home and working from home, and a lot of companies switching those jobs to become remote, for someone with a disability, that would that actually work to their advantage as well? Because their home is probably set up to accommodate their needs and kind of work to their schedule.
Yeah, Vivian, I think you're absolutely right. It's a game changer. And we've seen now, so we work with ICBC, we work with some of the larger organizations, and we've had some great discussions with HR teams, because in the past there was real reluctance to have people work remotely from home. Mm-hmm. And what they saw during COVID is, of course, they dispatched everybody to work from home. What they saw was that productivity rates actually went up. They didn't go down. And the problem employees stayed the problem employees at home, whether they were in the workplace or working from home. That didn't change, but it made them, so it made them more open to doing that in the future. So that is a huge game changer, especially for people in, communities across the province that don't have strong transit infrastructure in place. Opportunities aren't maybe as great as they are in major centers. So it's a major game changer for sure.
Mm-hmm. You touched on this a little bit, Jamie, but can you walk us through what you'd recommend an organization do if they're looking at the diversity within their institution? It's not very diverse. They are interested in supporting and hiring people with disabilities. Where do they start, and then how do they follow through with that?
So we brought employers together a few years ago, and we've come up with what we refer to as the 4 pillars. Keep it simple. And it starts with commitment, readiness, recruitment, and retention, right? So it starts with commitment. It starts with that intention of, we're going to be inclusive of people with diverse abilities. That usually helps if it comes from the business owner or comes from the top, right? It can sometimes come from the HR team that goes up, but it's much better if it's coming from the top. So that intention is set. And then you look at, what do we need to do? What do we need to do to prepare for diverse abilities in our workplace? So what adjustments do we need to make? Do we need to adjust our behavior-based interviews to be just a little more straightforward for people who might be neurodiverse? So putting that training in place, and it doesn't have to be long or extensive or even cost anything, because Work BC Centers, our organization, President's Group, has great information on their websites. We've got an e-learning system launching in May as well, probably during the same week. But readiness, preparing your organization to hiring managers, ops managers, look at the physical workspace, make sure it's accessible. The third thing is specific recruitment. So intentional recruitment out to organizations. When you've got a job opening, put it out to those trusted partnerships. Ask for referrals of people with disabilities. And then the fourth and final piece that often gets left sort of overlooked is retention. Once we've hired the person, we forget that people, to check in and make sure that people have an opportunity to thrive and grow and develop in their career with that organization. So commitment, readiness, recruitment, and retention.
That's awesome.
Does that help?
Yeah, that's awesome. That's amazing. Yeah. I guess kind of speaking on behalf of a lot of the small businesses who don't necessarily have the resources or the team in place to get these things done. Are there, certain resources or grants available to them that they can take advantage of to help them prepare?
Yeah, there may be some business grants that are available. That's a really good question. I'm not entirely familiar with that piece of it, but Small Business BC would probably be able to advise, and Small Business BC also has some resources on their website for small business community. But checking out the accessibleemployer.ca site, there's just a vast amount of information there. And some of that information is set up for larger businesses, some is set up for smaller businesses.
Thinking about that retention piece and the cultural awareness and education that needs to go into retention in tech, for example, we often hear even if there is a strategy for hiring more women, sometimes those one or two women within a large organization feel out of place and it's just not the right environment for them. So shifting over to sort of creating an environment where people of diverse abilities are able to thrive and stay, what kind of education, what kind of cultural transformation needs to happen, especially thinking about how there might be different generations within that workforce. Some people, my generation included, grew up with maybe more of an inclusion focused school, but other generations that certainly wasn't the case.
Exactly. Yeah, I think in larger organizations, what works really well around retention is having an employee resource group. So people being able to exchange information and also help to inform the leaders in that organization of some of the challenges and maybe the gaps or barriers so that can be addressed. But giving people a voice. In a smaller business, even having sort of a peer mentor, especially when starting, really helps to set that employment relationship up for success. Part of the retention piece is going to be what organizations do up front. So when a new person joins the company, how are they set up for success, right? Because that translates to a level of satisfaction, builds trust, keeps people thinking in a positive light about that or about their opportunities with that company. So yeah, I think that's what I would suggest on that front.
Great.
Yeah.
I'm curious too, and then Vivian, I'll pass it over to you for the chance for a final question or two. Should we shift our thinking to sort of being open to different kinds of thinking? And by that, I mean, as opposed to welcoming in one or two people who have disabilities into an organization and ensuring that it meets their needs, but going to them potentially for reflection and insight and different ideas that could maybe help the organization, not just with its inclusivity strategy, but help it thrive in other ways.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Being aware of, especially if this is the first time someone's been hired in the organization with diverse abilities, making a conscious effort to seek feedback and invite that feedback, welcome it. Will be, that individual will be the best source of information more than anything. I'd love for us to get to a point where, our organization is no longer needed. That's my dream. We work ourselves out of a job here because, inclusion is happening and I know it will happen. But there's still a lot of older mindsets out there, some bias and stigma and stereotype. There's still some work to be done. Yeah.
A quick follow-up, and Vivian, over to you, I promise. When do you think we're going to get there? Do you have a target in mind, or do you think that
I think that too.
Is that
How
your
long
question?
will this take? That was one of them, yeah.
Yeah, well, no, because we've been talking about this for a long time, Jamie, not necessarily on the disability focus, but when it comes to equity and diversity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we keep thinking we're going to get there, and we're still having the same conversations, still the same, organizations that are out there. And it's when do we get to that point that, to your point, they work themselves out of a job.
I know. And you know what, I'm hoping to retire at 65. So I think we're there in another few years. No, I think that particularly in hiring people with diverse abilities, there's been a lot of momentum. And in particular in BC, also in Ontario and on the East Coast, there's been a lot of momentum. And much of that has been driven by workforce shortages, to be honest, right? It had forced organizations to, when you cannot attract staff to work for your organization, you need to look at where you've always found staff. You need to look at what do you need to adapt, what do you need to do differently. How can we change our mindset to be more open to different groups of people, right? I think COVID has had a pretty major impact on women and also people with disabilities, for sure. Are we still having the same conversations? Yeah, but I'm seeing, when you see the kinds of organizations that are coming to the table and asking for us to recruit on their behalf and train their hiring managers, These are organizations that would not have been there 10 years ago. Right?
Yeah, fair enough. Vivian, did I steal your last question, or do you have a
No, I have one final one, and kind of speaking on behalf of just a lot of the students that, you know, I have the privilege to work with, as well as a lot of the job seekers that come to Startup Week, is if they were to have a disability, I guess, do you have any tips for them of how much they should share, or anything that they can ask a potential employer, just to know if it's the right fit and whether or not that employer is going to cater to their needs as well?
Wow, that's a great question. You two ask really good questions, by the way. Some are tough.
Good.
You know, disclosure is a very personal choice. I actually encourage it. And the reason for that is, I think if we focus on every person, you know, what do we need to do to set you up for success? And having that information, what might we need to adjust for you to do your best work in this job? That's not an accommodation question. That's not name your disability. It's focused on abilities in relation to the opportunity, right? Mm-hmm. So asking questions, you know, there might be someone who, for example, is neurodiverse and lives with autism. And for that individual to go into a situation, say, I'm autistic. And how many other people with autism work for your company? How do you view, how would you hire someone like me? Having an honest conversation around that is very personal, but even just asking for, you know, what are your views on a diverse workforce? You know, putting it out there. How do you view a diverse workforce? If I had autism and I applied to work with your company, what would you do? I think having open, honest conversations is important. Now, the more we kind of, I'll say, dance around the subject, it'll just always stay the same as it is, right?
Yeah, that's certainly the concern. I like your advice to have an applicant ask that question. And I hope if there are employers listening that maybe scares them a little
ready
through their answer if they don't have one ready, or think through you know, how they are maybe going to bring about diversity if the answer happens to be at this point in time, unfortunately, no, we don't have anyone who's autistic on our staff, for example.
Be interesting to see the answers to that.
Yeah. Final question, Jamie, what would be a resource or two you would recommend to an employer or an organization that wants to do more in this space? And you can include BC Win.
Another shameless, no, I'm just saying. There's a great resource that my friend and colleague Kristen Bauer and I developed, and this is with Mission Possible in Vancouver. And it's called Untapped Talent, a business-to-business guide on innovative hiring and retention. It's free. So if you search it, you'll find it. It's online. It's also hosted on the Presence Group website. And again, we'll be launching some e-learning, a 1-hour, 3-module e-learning program in mid-May. It's all targeted to business. So those, you know, the resources on the Presence Group site are just fantastic. So, and they're business oriented. So, so I think if you're interested, if a business is interested in any of these areas, starting there would be a good step.
Excellent, Jamie. Thank you so much for coming on the show with your insight. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Hayley. Thanks, Vivian, as well. I really appreciate the opportunity. Yeah.
And Vivian, thank you for guest co-hosting. I'm sorry I stole that question, but it's a great thing that we.
I had a backup.
Perfect. That's Jamie Millar-Dixon, a principal consultant with McLeod Silver HR Business Partners and an inclusive workforce consultant with BC Win. Vivian Chan is the Director of National Operations at Yale Canada and co-chair of Vancouver Startup Week and my guest co-host on the show today. I'm Hayley Woodin, Executive Editor at BIV. Thank you so much for joining us for EDI on BIV, a new podcast series from Business in Vancouver. We'll be back next week with a new episode of our show.